With a little over 6 weeks until the NHL trade deadline, and the Oilers have already added John Klingberg and Evander Kane, what exactly are they going to be in the market for ahead of March 5th's NHL trade deadline? On today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. I am your host, Nick Zararis. I want to thank everyone who's making Locked On Oilers their first listen of the day. Locked On Oilers, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's show is brought to you by FanDuel, where from the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel is making the NFL playoffs even more exciting. And right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's edition of Locked On Oilers, what Evander Kane's eventual return to the lineup means for the forward group, what John Klingberg's potential addition to the defensive group means for the defensive group at large, and then who exactly makes sense for the Oilers to target ahead of the NHL trade deadline. So let's start with the most obvious. We know Evander Kane is a number of weeks away from returning to NHL action, and we can all understand that the Oilers have put themselves in a position where Evander Kane is going to serve as a de facto trade deadline addition. And we have seen teams across sport do this, where a player who misses significant portions of, or most of, or frankly, all of the regular season is used as an augmentation to the lineup. It is used as a means of improving the lineup internally without having to burn additional assets. And there are associated risks with this, and we talked about it a few weeks ago on an episode of the show when we got a news update on Evander Kane that he had his knee scoped for some additional work. He had some additional surgery in his knee. It wasn't restructuring or repairing of anything. It was, if I remember correctly, there was some buildup or something like that, but it wasn't a significant injury, but it did slow down the recovery process of the major injury, that core injury he had suffered last year and played through the playoffs with, and ultimately got pulled from the lineup because of surgery that he had put off. Because Evander Kane's initial plan was to just physical therapy the injury and work his way back that way without corrective surgery. And when Kane came to training camp in the fall in September and went through the entry physicals, the Oilers and Kane deemed him unable to play if he had not undergone surgery. He undergoes the surgery for that core injury, and then he undergoes this knee cleanup operation, the way Evander Kane described it a few weeks ago, and that firmly puts him in the camp of returning right around mid-April when the NHL playoffs start. We can have an entirely different conversation as far as the spirit of the rules and what NHL GMs think of them, but for the Oilers' purposes, I think the looming return of Evander Kane for the playoffs means they are not in a position to be adding a forward of note. Now, I do think they could potentially look for a fourth-line center. I think Derek Ryan going down to Bakersfield and clearing waivers, which he did about 25 minutes ago as of the time of this recording on Monday afternoon. But with Derek Ryan no longer on the NHL roster, and look, he's always a phone call away, they can get him back up, whatever. There is the opportunity here for Noah Phillip to solidify himself. And Noah Phillip does not have a lot of NHL experience. He has 5 games. He's played less than 100 minutes at the NHL level. Took a penalty in that Canucks game, which I know people will say, that's why you don't want that young guy in that type of role. That's why we typically see fourth lines or spots for proven, established veterans, because coaches want a level of trust and a level of familiarity from that spot. You know, we talk a lot about when the Oilers' fourth line has been at its best, it's playing 4 corners. You know, that Perry line, they get the puck in deep, they cycle it around the perimeter of the offensive zone, they make the defense move. Occasionally they can chip in a goal, but they're mostly out there to bring the temperature of the game down, to slow the tempo down and force the other team to work a little bit and to take some heat off of the Edmonton defense. And what Evander Kane's eventual return to the lineup is going to do is create a logjam. And we knew coming into the season that the Oilers were going to eventually have to answer this question. They have a good problem in the sense that Vasily Podkolzin has been significantly more impactful and more helpful, I think is the word I would use to describe it, than they probably initially had forecasted it. Of course, Podkolzin started the year on the fourth line, playing with Derek Ryan and Corey Perry, and through a little bit of grit, a little bit of good luck in terms of getting the initial opportunity, Podkolzin has stuck with Leon Draisaitl on that second line, and that's created a log jam down the left side because the Oilers have Jeff Skinner, who was not in the lineup against Vancouver, Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, Vasily Podkolzin, and whoever you want to play on the left of that fourth line. Now, because of that, you can ask, what do you want to do with Evander Kane? I don't think you're going to see him return to Draisaitl's wing, where he has spent time over the last 2 seasons. I think you want to keep Podkolzin with Draisaitl until it stops working. And I do want to say, all of this is within the context of the regular season. In the playoffs, I am a lot less married to lines and pairs. I am a lot more willing to ride the hot hand, whatever happens to be working in a given game or series, where if Podkolzin and Draisaitl aren't connecting for whatever reason in the playoffs, that particular opponent they're playing is doing something that's minimizing their impact, okay, then we can have a conversation. But for right now, we're talking about this in the abstract in terms of theory. You're probably not playing Nugent-Hopkins on the fourth line. You're probably not playing Jeff Skinner on the fourth line. You're probably not playing Evander Kane on the fourth line. So we're playing Matthias Janmark on the fourth line. I think I'm okay with that. If you want to tell me the fourth line, game one of the playoffs, is Noah Phillip, Corey Perry, and Matthias Janmark, I think I'm okay with that, if that means Evander Kane is playing with Adam Henrique and with Connor Brown. Now, I don't know what the future holds for Jeff Skinner in Edmonton. I think the fact that they've continued to choose to dress Josh Brown, who we can be objective and say he is not an NHL regular. He is not good enough to be an NHL regular consistently. As the 8th defenseman in the organizational depth chart, I think he is okay. I don't think you want him playing come playoff time. I think as depth, he's fine, but you don't want to play him. And we're going to talk about the defense in a minute in the next segment, because I think that's a significantly more interesting conversation because of the options the Oilers have at their disposal, as opposed to in terms of their internal options, as opposed to who they could potentially add. I think the Klingberg addition is a really interesting point of conversation, but Evander Kane coming back into the mix for the playoffs means you can almost certainly rule out any of those pie in the sky ideas. You know, as fun as it would be to bring Taylor Hall back to Edmonton after all these years, I don't really think that makes a lot of sense, considering you already have too many left wings. Look, I think Taylor Hall probably can offer you more than Evander Kane at this moment, but there is something to be said for Evander Kane's skill set. As much as I might have my qualms with Evander Kane, the person, because of how he conducts himself, he has a skill set that the Oilers value. They clearly think his edge, the ruggedness, and the hits he throws is something they don't have a lot of. They don't have a lot of physicality in their lineup, so they're willing to put a premium on Kane and tolerate maybe a little bit less effective play in terms of chance creation and defense, because he's one of the few guys on the team that's willing to forecheck, to hit, and to play with that little bit of snarl that most teams feel like is requisite with being a Stanley Cup contender. We're going to take our first break of today's edition of Locked On Oilers. When we come back, we'll talk about what the John Klingberg addition does to the back end. And then in our final segment, we'll talk about who's actually in the cards as far as potential additions in this edition of Locked On Oilers. So be sure to stick around. From the first whistle to the final drive, FanDuel makes the NFL playoffs even more exciting. Right now, new customers can bet $5 and get $300 in bonus bets if you win your first bet. It's $300 to keep the action going. The FanDuel app is easy to navigate, and the variety of bets keeps every game exciting. Plus, when you win, you get paid instantly. No waiting around for your winnings. This upcoming weekend, you guys know the deal. Championship weekend in the NFL, I-95 showdown in the NFC title game, the Washington Commanders and rookie quarterback Jaden Daniels heading up to Philly to take on the Eagles, where the Eagles are 5.5-point favorites. And then It is time. For the fourth time in the Mahomes Josh Allen era, the Bills will meet the Chiefs in the playoffs. The Chiefs are 1.5 point favorites. Home field, Arrowhead Stadium, one of the defining rivalries of this era of the NFL. And you can get in on the action over at FanDuel. So visit fanduel.com or download the app and get started with $300 in bonus bets. That's fanduel.com. Make this playoff season unforgettable with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. Thank you to everyone who's hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers. And now, if you're listening to this episode, you might be a little confused and say, well, Nick, you said on the Monday episode that you would talk to us after the game against the Capitals. In my late night delusions, when I was recording the episode for Monday, I misread the schedule. I Googled Oilers next game and saw it said tomorrow. In my brain, I thought that was still Sunday, where it would be Monday night. And of course, it was already Monday night by the time I had started recording. So that meant that game is tomorrow. Of course, we will have an episode for you as soon as that game goes final. But in the interim, in the present, the John Klingberg edition is the latest in a series of moves where the Oilers are capitalizing on their desirability as a landing spot in terms of contender status, the opportunity to play on a good team, and calculated risk. And anytime you can sign a player who has an NHL track record in season, they're going to have baggage. And there are different types of baggage. There are injury things, there are off the ice things. And in the Oilers case, adding Corey Perry, Evander Kane, those were off the ice things. In the case of John Klingberg, it's working your way back from a serious injury. You could say, to some degree, Victor Arvidsson is in a similar boat, although he played at the end of last season for the Kings before ultimately signing with the Oilers. But Klingberg is a low-risk gamble, and the money is a little rich for what he might bring to the table, but I think this is the type of risk you take if you are on the goal line. And when you are as close as the Oilers were last year, you're going to end up, for the most part, tinkering around the edges, looking for every last bit of potential improvement on the ancillary level. You are going to look to improve your depth, and you are going to look for supporting cast players who might be able to bring out more from who you already have. You know, think of the way the Oilers have used Podkolzin this year as a means of augmenting what Draisaitl does well. In theory, the idea was to use Jeff Skinner and Victor Arvidsson to augment what Leon Draisaitl did well, but those marriages didn't work out for varying reasons. Now, Arvidsson, I don't think has been bad, but I don't think he's been good as I've expected. And in terms of the defense, and I said this on the episode we did on John Klingberg, the bonus episode right after the signing went official on Friday, which I do recommend you go check out because it's a lot more in-depth than the segment we're going to do right now. But Klingberg is an opportunity. And when a player only costs money, he doesn't cost draft picks, he doesn't cost players, and you have the requisite cap space to bring said player in, the worst case scenario is you have to eat a little bit of money. And Klingberg is only signed through the end of this year. There's no multi-year commitment. And I think this is an audition for Klingberg. And he skated on Monday as the seventh defenseman. We will see how long it takes for the Oilers to include him in their lineup. I think the Oilers would benefit massively if they're going to continue to tinker with their group to start with Klingberg in an 11-7 alignment. I think playing with seven defensemen generally is a misguided approach to managing a game. I understand it from the perspective of it gets another forward extra ice time. In this case, it's getting McDavid more ice time. And anytime you can sneak McDavid another 2 to 3 minutes per game of ice time, you want to do it because he's the singularly most impactful player in the entire sport. But in the long term, I think the Oilers would benefit massively from trying to find the right mix of guys that play well together. And they've done an admirable job of piecing together two defensive pairs. If you'll recall, the episodes we were recording here in October and November, where the second and third pairs most nights were an adventure, where it was Emerson, it was Stetcher, it was Travis Dermott, it was Brett Kulak, Josh Brown got in there a couple times. There wasn't really a settling down until this great stretch started. You know, we've been using November 23rd as the point of demarcation where the season kind of turned around. And the defensive results since then have been significantly better. The Oilers are controlling play a lot more. They are scoring first. They are giving their defense less responsibility in terms of picking up the buck within a game and being the difference. And when the Oilers are at their best, they're outscoring their problems. And usually we say that goes away in the playoffs, but as the NHL has trended more towards offense, it has trended more towards athletic and offensively inclined defensemen. We have seen teams be more able to score at higher rates in the postseason than we would say 5 or 10 years ago, and there is a connection there. But I think Klingberg, at best, is probably going to be a supporting cast player. I think the most optimistic read of John Klingberg is he was dealing with significant discomfort in his body. He had to have double hip resurfacing. You think about where your bones meet at your hips and how much discomfort he was in just walking, let alone playing a professional sport. And if he isn't feeling any immediate discomfort and he can play, and we only have to talk about the hockey output, I think John Klingberg can be a perfectly serviceable third pair right-handed defenseman. But based on the way he has played defense dating back to like 2018, I don't think you would feel comfortable as a Stanley Cup contender playing him on your second pair. I think your second pair is going to typically get your more difficult assignments. I think they are going to play more minutes than Klingberg can probably effectively give you. I think a lot of Klingberg's perceived value, even dating back to his time in Dallas, where he was one of the more underrated players in the league, was operating a power play, running it as the quarterback, offensive impacts, playing higher in the lineup. We always talk about how Ekholm and Bouchard get to play a majority of their minutes with McDavid, and that's going to give them a juice to their counting stats, the same way that when Klingberg was in Dallas, he was playing with Jamie Benn and Tyler Seguin. And I don't think it's entirely impossible that Klingberg has more in the tank and he's fine playing with Nurse. But I think, and we're going to talk about it in the next segment, I think ideally you end up with Klingberg on your third pair, and then you make an executive decision. Do we trust Ty Emberson to ride shotgun with Darnell Nurse? Do we want to use Klingberg as our seventh defenseman, where we're going to use him on a game-by-game basis, how he feels, the quality of opponent, what we think we can do with him? Or do we think this experiment is entirely not going to work? That's why it's a good thing they signed him when they did. They get a nice 4.5, 5 weeks to ramp him up to the trade deadline and get a firm evaluation of where he's at and how effective he can be. That way, when the deadline does come, they can target one of the guys we're going to talk about in the next segment. So be sure to stick around to this edition of Locked On Oilers, where we've got your team covered every day. In sports, having a winning strategy is everything. It's how the best teams make it to the Super Bowl, the World Series, and the Olympics, and the same goes for life. Having a strategy like life insurance from SelectQuote can protect your financial legacy and keep your family's future secure. SelectQuote makes it easy to find the perfect life insurance policy. As one of America's leading insurance brokers with nearly 40 years of experience, they've helped over 2 million customers find $700 billion in coverage since 1985. What sets SelectQuote apart is their personal touch. Unlike other brokers that offer one-size-fits-all policies, their licensed agents tailor coverage to fit your unique needs. If you're in good health, you might even qualify for same-day coverage of up to $5 million. No medical exam required. And it's more affordable than you think. You can get up to $1 million in coverage for as little as $20 a month. Get the right life insurance policy for you for less at selectquote.com/lockedonnhl. Go to selectquote.com/lockedonnhl today to get started. That is selectquote.com/lockedonnhl. SelectQuote. They shop, you save. Thank you to everyone who is hanging out on this Tuesday edition of Locked On Oilers, where we are doing Trade Deadline Wishlist 2.0. This episode will be a recurring episode theme as we get closer to the trade deadline. But I have always been of the opinion, and I think it's really important, that you exhaust all of your internal options before you get to the trade deadline, because it is incumbent upon you as a general manager and as a decision maker to understand what you have before you can fully determine what it is you still need. I would compare it to checking the fridge before grocery shopping. That way you don't end up with 2 gallons of milk as opposed to 1 gallon of milk if you only need the one. You don't want redundancy. And frankly, you don't want a missed opportunity. And that's why I think Noah Phillip getting some run is a good idea. It's why I think John Klingberg getting some run is a good idea. Now, I am not expecting a lot from John Klingberg. I can just come out and say it. I don't think, based on even before the major physical decline in terms of the hip injuries, I think that his defense was declining before he was dealing with those nagging injuries. So even if he's feeling better, I think his skill set isn't well suited for the role the Oilers need. When we talk about the role the Oilers need, they need a complementary player for Darnell Nurse. And they've tried a few different guys this year. They've tried Emberson, they've tried Dermott, they've tried Stetcher, they've tried Kulak. Kulak has probably worked the best of that group, but if they can run Klingberg out there with Nurse for 3 to 4 weeks and the results are passable, I'm not even saying good. They don't need to win their minutes 5-on-5. They don't need to have an edge in expected goals or high danger. But if they're 47, 48%, they're passable. I think that's reasonable. And I think that would tell me that Klingberg is good enough to be in this lineup come playoff time. But I think fundamentally, if you're just going to settle for adding John Klingberg and Evander Kane, and I guess technically Noah Phillip to this group, I think that's aiming too low. And you can say the Oilers do need to start worrying about next year, or the year after that. And once they figure out what McDavid's long-term contract and Evan Bouchard's long-term contracts look like, respectively, then I think we'll start to see whatever the long-term vision of the Oilers is begin to take shape, because Nugent-Hopkins, Zach Hyman, Matthias Ekholm, those guys are all making consequential amounts of money, but they are also, I don't want to say winding down in their careers because they're all still above average to very good NHL players, but they are not going to maintain this level in perpetuity for the remaining of the duration of their contracts. And it is incumbent upon you as a general manager to be able to balance out that short-term interest versus the long-term interest. And ideally, you're going to be able to manage both of those simultaneously, meaning you're going to make short-term decisions that don't impact you long-term, and there's always going to be trade-off. If you're trading futures of any kind, whether it's a prospect, a draft pick, whatever, you are by definition hindering your team's future, because that's an asset you're not going to be able to realize in the future. We talk about the idea of liquidity in assets, of do you have prospects or do you have draft picks? Picks are more liquid than prospects because picks can be anything. The mystery box, the episode of Family Guy. Do you want the boat or do you want the mystery box? Because the mystery box could have anything. It could even have a boat. That's kind of how teams look at draft picks. And the Oilers have drafted a lot of players over the last handful of years, and they have yet to materialize into anything consistent at the NHL level. And that's an organizational directive. The Oilers under Ken Holland, dating even Ken Holland's time in Detroit, always over marinated their prospects in the NHL. But as far as targets, I have a rough list here. So the pie in the sky, entirely unrealistic. I don't see a world where the Oilers could do this, and I don't think they make sense as a trade partner. Simon Nemec of the New Jersey Devils. And you might say, well, Nick, Nemitz is unproven. He doesn't have playoff experience. He's never won anything. He's never been a player of consequence on a good team. And I would agree with you. You look at Nemitz, he has 69 career NHL games played. His career average in time on ice is 19 minutes and 22 seconds per game. He played a lot last year on an injured Devils team. And it was not in the cards for the Devils' plan last year was not to play Nemitz 60 regular season games. They were a mash unit last year. Injuries up and down the lineup, Dougie Hamilton, Jonas Siegenthaler, and because of that, they went and overcompensated. They added Brendan Dillon, they added Brett Pesce. Of course, Luke Hughes is there as well. But Dougie got healthy, Siegenthaler got healthy. Kovacek that they traded for from Montreal has been great for them. So now they're in a position where Nemitz is a luxury. He very well might be a good NHL defenseman. I am inclined to think he will be because of what he looked like last year as a 19-year-old, and I think there's a lot of room there. I don't think the Oilers have assets the Devils would want because the Devils, much like the Oilers, are in win now mode. And draft picks, prospects, that doesn't really do anything for the Devils prospect. The Devils prospects in terms of winning, not in terms of their literal prospects as in their players. But going down the list, Ryan Lindgren of the Rangers, I don't really see a fit there, but he is a player that is purported to be available on the trade market. I think the left-handedness makes him a little more prohibitive. I don't think the Oilers want to play somebody on their offside on that line. I think the Rangers would be more inclined to take futures than the Devils would. They would be more inclined to take a second or a third round pick and a prospect than, say, the Devils might be, because the Rangers probably should be looking towards next year. David Savard, who has been mentioned by both Frank Saravalli and by Bob Stauffer as a potential fit. I think Savard is too old to realistically bank on as a second pair defenseman if you're going to go the distance. At 34 years old, got a lot of miles on the tires. I don't necessarily think he has the skating and the mobility requisite with playing the type of minutes that the Oilers are going to give him, whoever ends up getting that role. And then to varying degrees, Ivan Provorov, Jeff Petrie, Vladislav Gavrikov, Alec Martinez, Brian Dumoulin, Ian Cole, Henry Jokiharju, Ali Mata, Jan Rudo, Will Borgen, Dante Fabro. I don't think any of those guys jump off the page as obvious number 2 defensemen to play with Nurse. I think of that list, Provorov is probably the best, but being that the Blue Jackets are in a playoff spot right now, they haven't made the playoffs in several seasons. I think they're going to be inclined to ride it out with Provorov and see how the rest of the season goes. I think Jeff Petrie in Detroit, I think that makes sense because it won't cost a lot. I think Detroit would be inclined to take futures. I don't think his defense is good enough. And that's really the question here. Can you find a defenseman who has good enough defensive traits to supplement Darnell Nurse's strength, to put both in a position to form a better pair than what they can currently construct? And it's weird to say, but I think Kulak and Nurse is adequate enough that none of the guys I just mentioned would be that significant of an improvement. Now, if it's not going to cost a lot, we're talking mid-round picks, 3s and 5s, or B, C level prospects, that's different. But being that there aren't any great players available at this trade deadline, I think there's a strong argument for rolling the dice with Klingberg and eventually Evander Kane. I think no matter what, if you're the Oilers, you need to add at least one more body. So you force Josh Brown entirely out of the cards come playoff time because you want Stetcher to be the first guy into the lineup from the press box. But I do think that'll do it for today's edition of Locked On Oilers. Now, if you could be so kind, please subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify, please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell, get a notification whenever new content goes live. Now I can say I will talk to you guys after the Capitals game. Everyone have a safe, fun night. Talk to you guys then. Until then, let's go Oilers.